Could you comment on the newest moves that Trump and his military complex have made in Syria and Afghanistan, and what you think their end game is here?
Well, you've probably seen that today the United States used a 21,000 kilo bomb, biggest bomb in the arsenal, short of nuclear weapons, on some mountainous area in Afghanistan. Did whatever horrible damage it did, we have no idea. It's considered very, in our culture and society, very courageous to send a huge bomb somewhere, you don't know where, and do whatever damage is done, and we all applaud the great heroic achievement of the president. That's a cultural problem here. Suppose that the bomb does kill a lot of people in ISIS. Let's say it does. I have no idea what it's going to do. I don't think the Pentagon knows. But suppose it does. What's the effect, aside from murdering a lot of people? Well, we have a good reason to predict what the effect is going to be. We actually have, by now, at least almost 20 years of experience. What was Al-Qaeda back in the year 2000? Okay, it was a tiny little group stuck somewhere in a tribal area of northwest Afghanistan, Pakistan, tolerated by the Taliban, who didn't like it very much and were probably happy to get rid of it. That was pre-9/11. Where is Al-Qaeda now, or its related organizations, or its outgrowths like ISIS? All over the world. Southeast Asia, West Africa. In fact, the worst radical Islamist terrorism in the world is West Africa, a result of the bombing of Libya, which sent weapons and jihadis into West Africa. In fact, every act, we have reacted to every act by violence, by a hammer, by a sledgehammer, and each time we expand radical Islam, each single time. If the goal is to eliminate that threat, what we are doing is magnifying it. The record is very clear, and it's not hard to see why. These things have roots. If you don't deal with the roots and you just smash it by force, you just increase the support. And if we happen to kill lots of people in ISIS, it'll probably spread their ideology, the proof that the West is just trying to destroy Islam. We're not dealing with the roots of what led to ISIS or what leads people to join it. So as just a pure tactical question, quite aside from any matters of principle, this is absolutely the worst possible way to deal with radical Islam. And in fact, we should bear in mind that at the same time, we are directly supporting the sources of radical Islam, which happen to be mostly in Saudi Arabia. That's where it's emanating from. That's where the Wahhabi, Salafi roots are. That's where the madrasas are being spread from. What are we doing with Saudi Arabia? We're pouring arms into Saudi Arabia so that they can carry out a horrible humanitarian crisis in Yemen, both by bombing and by imposing starvation. Is that a way to deal with the effect of terror? What about the bombing of Syria? First of all, do we know what happened? Actually, we don't. We know that there was use of chemical weapons. Before any action should be taken, one should first try to find out what happened. Well, I don't know, but there are perfectly credible figures who have raised very serious questions about it. Lawrence Wilkerson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff, Patrick Lang, DIA colonel, who's one of the leading analysts of Middle East for many years in the DIA, Scott Ritter, who exposed the scam of the weapons in Iraq, have all published significant reports saying there's good reason to question the claims about what happened. Just this morning, there was a very important article, a posting that came out by Theodore Postel, MIT scientist who's been one of the most sophisticated and successful analysts of military strategic issues. He's actually one of the authors of that article in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that I mentioned. He went through in detail the White House intelligence report claiming that it was Syrians and just tears it to shreds. He says it's inconceivable that intelligence analysts could ever produce such a thing. Well, where does all this leave us? Incidentally, the press has reported on what they call conspiracy theories. Like the Times had a big article on conspiracy theories about the Syrian bombing, and it picked completely unknown, non-credible people, and it was able easily to tear the reports to shreds. It systematically avoided every credible source. That raises some questions. And the general question that it does raise is, before you carry out a military act, you first try to find out, allegedly in retaliation, you find out what happened. Then you try to gain some, if you can determine what happened, gain some international legitimacy for carrying it out. Other than that, it's just in fact, the attack on the airfield was apparently a pretty meaningless show of force. They hit a mostly empty area of airfield, which was used again the next day for bombing attacks. So it looks like a show for the domestic audience, saying, look, I'm tougher than Obama or something, now let's go on to the next thing. That's not the way to deal with a serious problem. And I think and this goes back to what I was talking about. If you take a close look at issue after issue, whether it's North Korea, whether it was ICBMs, whether it was Khrushchev's reduction of armaments, whether it's North Korea today, any of these things, almost invariably, there are peaceful options. In fact, let's take 9/11, okay? That obviously happened, major terror attack, okay? Were there alternative ways of dealing with it? Well, one way was to consider the offers by the Taliban to extradite Osama bin Laden. He was suspected, I stress, suspected of carrying out the attack. And it's important to mention suspected. 8 months later, after the most intensive international investigation in history, the head of the FBI informed the press that the U.S. suspected bin Laden, but couldn't demonstrate it yet, okay? So there were suspicions. What do you do when there are suspicions that somebody carried out a criminal attack? Well, first you try to apprehend them if you can, investigate them, bring them to justice. Was that possible? Very well might have been. The Taliban did make tentative proposals about possible independent trial of bin Laden. The U.S. flatly rejected it. It didn't ask for extradition for the simple reason they had no evidence. Could that have solved the problem without bombing Afghanistan? Bombing of Afghanistan was bitterly condemned, not only by the international aid agencies, because millions of Afghans were on the verge of starvation. Nobody knew what was going to happen. It was also bitterly condemned by some of the leading anti-Taliban Afghan militants. The most important of them, the most respected of them, was Abdul Haq, who finally went into Afghanistan and was killed. He bitterly attacked the bombing. He said the United States is just trying to show its muscle. It's harming Afghans. It's undermining our efforts to overthrow the Taliban from within. He was supported by many Afghan anti-Taliban militants, but these issues are just not, none of this is even an option. We want to use force, period. We don't ask about the consequences. We don't ask whether there are peaceful means. I mean, I've mentioned some cases. There's case after case. And I think those should be prominent on our thinking. The use of force tends to have destructive effects of all kinds. We should always ask whether there are possible peaceful means that can be explored. There often are. And I think that's true in these cases.